It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Hetherington from the University of New South Wales. Stephen is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, Editor-in-Chief of the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, a little bit of product placement here, and author of numerous books and articles on epistemology, including Good Knowledge, Bad Knowledge on 2 Dogmas of Epistemology, Self-Knowledge, Beginning Philosophy Right Here and Now, Yes, but How Do You Know? Introducing Philosophy Through Skeptical Ideas, and How to Know a Practicalist Conception of Knowledge. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Deb. It's great to be here.
I was intrigued by one of the titles of your book, namely Yes, but How Do You Know? Introducing Philosophy Through Skeptical Ideas. Why do you think it's important for budding philosophers to think about epistemology?
Oh, well, look, apart from anything else, you've got to think, well, epistemology is reflection upon knowledge and its nature. And particularly with that book, what I was trying to do there was to get people to think a little bit skeptically about their own stance on the world and on their fundamental kind of commitments and the concepts, everything that actually they use every day to day that they think would actually make them themselves. So the idea is, you get around and you have this confidence about yourself and how you act, and you've got this great cognitive perspective on the world, and you're a rational being that acts not just willy-nilly but on the basis of knowledge and some sort of really positive, deep connection to the world. Well, epistemology in particular gets you to slow down and to ask yourself whether you can justify that kind of presumption about yourself. So in other words, you've got this kind of comforting picture about yourself, and then you say, well, look, maybe you're not right about this, maybe you're not right about that. So it's epistemology that sort of pulls together those maybe you're not rights and tell me why and give me reasons. And then as a result of that, maybe gets you to say, do you really know that, for example, you're this rational being that understands the world and is reacting to the world in kind of sensible, clear-headed ways? So that's where epistemology gets into it.
Oh, that's excellent. So you've written a lot on the definition of knowledge or the possibilities of defining knowledge. Why is knowledge so hard to define?
Yeah, look, I don't actually know that it's any harder than a lot of other fundamental philosophical concepts, but I honestly don't know. Epistemologists maybe they're more self-critical about than some other philosophers. That's hard to judge. So, but it has been hard to define. So certainly Western philosophy, we typically think of it as, certainly in written, in sort of systematic form, we think of it as coming from Plato's dialogues. And one of the kind of recurring themes in a few of those dialogues is precisely the attempt to understand knowledge. Now that was possibly because you've got these guys standing around, whatever, trying to understand various concepts, and at any given moment they're thinking, well, we're making these claims. So we're making claims about goodness and beauty, what's right and wrong, etc. But what about these claims themselves? Anyone can say anything. And yeah, we're smart guys and we're standing around and that's all good. But what's the quality control on this? How do we get to work out that what we've just said might be knowledge, might not just be hot air? Well, let's step back for a moment and think about what knowledge is. And they did. And so what you got there, at least in a couple of the dialogues, you've got a particular kind of picture of knowledge that was put forward, was examined, critically assessed, and to be honest, left sort of hanging. But that picture is one that contemporary philosophers have come to call the justified true belief conception of knowledge. So that's a kind of picture whereby you say, and this is about an individual's knowledge at this point, it's not to say about groups. So you say, take an individual. So like, how do you know that you're sitting there? Like, what is your knowing that you're sitting there? It would be, on this picture, it would be you having a belief, a kind of view, a a belief or a view that you're there. That belief or view would be right. You are sitting there. And somehow or other, you've got some kind of rational connection to that truth. For example, you can feel that you're sitting there, and you can look down and see a chair, that kind of thing. So that philosophers call that having a kind of what they call epistemic justification, but just think of it as a kind of rational support. So you've got a belief, it's correct, and you've got rational support for it. So that's the justified true belief conception. Now, in 1960, would you like me to tell you about the Gettier challenge?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was going to ask you what you think the main advantages of that view are, what's promising about the view, and then ask you about some of the disadvantages. Yeah. And with the disadvantages, I would love for you to speak about the Gettier problem, since you're a leading expert on exactly that problem.
Okay, thanks. Well, the advantages are partly simplicity, that you've got... See, epistemology, as I said before, it's meant to be a kind of... It's long been regarded by most philosophers as one of the very, very central bits of philosophy. And part of it's because, again, as I said, whatever you're kind of doing when you try to think about things, we're all... Let's, for the moment, think of us all as trying to get knowledge of things. And so the justified true belief conception is, in its generality and simplicity, claims to be able to account for anyone's knowledge in any situation. So that's power. So anyone, go out on the street and ask them anything, think of anything that they know. Go into any university, any bureaucracy, wherever, ask them what they know. And the claim is that the justified true belief conception, a very simple, easy to state kind of picture, will, in a general way, encompass every one of those bits of knowledge. So the idea is no matter what the subject matter, you're right, you got a view, and it's rationally supported. So when you're building theories, simplicity and power are really important criteria. So that's kind of a key aspect of it. Maybe let me give you, I can sort of give you a better picture of the power of it. I mean, I've just gone straight to the picture, but think about alternatives. So it's a picture whereby you are making distinctions, say very clear distinctions between knowledge and, for example, unsupported opinion, mere guesses, even supposedly lucky guesses. So the idea is that it's not enough to be right. It's not enough to have a conviction. You've got to have that kind of bigger rational kind of connection underlying it. And that's not trivial, because if you try to think about what most people have, or what a lot of people have on a lot of views, they probably don't have a lot of rational support. I mean, look, there's plenty of things that I could give opinions on, which why bother listening to me? Because I know nothing about it. But I can have opinions. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, so the theory, even if I go straight to it and it automatically sounds like a package, so it all sounds simple, but it's not trivial, because there really are alternatives. So it's like saying to everyone out there, it's not enough just to have opinions. It doesn't matter how people sometimes say, but I really feel it. Well, tough. That doesn't make it knowledge. So you've got a philosophical theory here, a long-standing one, which starts to tell us why that isn't enough.
It makes explicit justification when I don't think that is intuitively explicit to a lot of people when they talk about knowing something, but this definition actually brings that out very clearly.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, it's true. That is actually helpful because, for example, the definition is powerful enough to encompass not only justification where you've consciously worked through it, which, like in universities, for example, Lots of us do. When you know, at school, university, you know, the student is hopefully led through reasoning. That's conscious, that's being self-aware. But a lot of the time we don't do that. We just react to the world, and that's maybe just our senses reacting in a hopefully a reliable and predictable kind of way, but we won't be aware of it. Nonetheless, the theory will still say, whether or not you're aware of it, you're justified. Edmund Gettier, he published almost nothing, but his name we now talk of in philosophy and epistemology, there's Gettier cases, Gettier beliefs, you know.
Being Gettiered.
Being Gettiered, exactly, that's right.
Become a verb.
It's absolutely right, yeah. So as I say, this 2 and a bit page paper in 1963 in an academic journal, and he basically said, well, let's focus on that definition. We'll treat that justified true belief definition. He said, well, look, we seem to be able to find a version of it in Plato, and then he pointed to another couple of versions of it among very prominent contemporary thinkers of the time, and he said, well, okay, but here's possibly a reason why it's not right. And so what he did was think up a couple of imaginary cases, thought experiments, philosophers call them, in which you've got someone who has a belief, it's correct, and there is that kind of rational, evidential support. Didn't mention the word evidence before, but it's important here. So the person has evidence, uses it, goes through that, reasons, ends up with this belief, it's true. The belief is true. But according to the standard epistemological response to the cases, that belief is not knowledge. I'll give you a case in a moment, but the bigger picture is just then, if Gettier was right, then the definition was wrong. It wasn't enough, because the definition was saying, any time you've got a belief that's true and, you know, well enough supported by justification, evidence, that's good enough for knowledge. And equally, whenever there's someone knowing something, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find them having a belief that's true, justified. So Gettier, if he was right, was describing beliefs, showing that it's possible to have a belief that's true and justified, and not knowledge. There's a ton of Gettier cases. That was 1963. Let me just sort of say quickly, what happened then was philosophers thought this has just got to be so easy to solve. So the idea was, well, hang on, so we just have to tinker with the definition of knowledge a bit to kind of show that, see, there was like a glitch, something went wrong in these cases. Fine, we'll just describe it. We'll then go back, revisit the definition, add a little clause which says, and the belief, you know, and which says, and by the way, the person with the justified true belief is not in that kind of case. And there we go, that's knowledge. Yeah, well, it's 50 plus years on, and there's been a whole bunch of theories and lots of attempts, and epistemologists have, I don't know literally, but they may as well have torn their hair out over this kind of thing. They've just gone back and forth, and it's become almost a byword for intricate philosophy, in a lot of people's views, getting nowhere, meaning there's no agreed on kind of way to revise the definition. So
that'd be a good title for a paper, Gettiering Nowhere.
Gettiering Nowhere.
Sorry.
Gettiering Nowhere. Well, no one's thought of that one, I think. I'll give you a look, just to make it fun. Look, part of the thing about Gettier cases is they're fun. Gettier had 2 cases in his paper, and yeah, they're a little kind of cutesy in some ways, but he was the first, and it's like, well, I don't know, historically he was the first. Bertrand Russell had a case back a bit. There's some Indian cases way back, some hundreds of years ago, etc. But in Western philosophy, Gettier got the credit. Okay, here's a nice case, not from Gettier, but from 1966 from Roderick Chisholm, one of the most prominent philosophers of his day. It's called the sheep in the field case. Simple. So you're standing outside a field, you look in, yeah, you're a little way off, you see this thing which looks like a sheep. We can build in more details. Let's say it sounds like a sheep, it smells like a sheep. Anyway, perceptual evidence tells you it's a sheep. And so you're just looking casually, you see, yeah, there's a sheep in that field. Okay, So that's your belief. There's a sheep in the field. Your belief is true because a little hill there is a sheep in the field. What you're looking at is a disguised dog. Like it's got a sheep, a fleece over it. Let's suppose that, I don't know, this is embellishing Chisholm's case, but the farmers put some little recording of a sheep in there inside, but it's made sure it has the good smells and so on. Anyway, so the point is you've got this sensory evidence. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's normal good.
Mm.
So what you're looking at is not a sheep, but there is a sheep in the field. So the question, so you have a belief, it's true, and it's evidentially justified. Question, is that belief knowledge? Usual response by philosophers? Of course not. Challenge then becomes, well, why not? And that's why I say we've had 50 plus years.
Mm.
So that's a Gettier case. Should I give you another?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, Bertrand Russell's, a lot of people think of this as, it's a more subtle one, but think of it from back, I think, was it 1948, I think. A lot of people have heard of it, and it's a simple one, the stop clock. So a clock where, you see the hands on it, an old-fashioned kind of clock, and it's stopped. But it's stopped, therefore, showing a time. You go past, you look up, you think, oh, right, it's 2 o'clock. Keep going. It is 2 o'clock. There's only twice, there's only every 12 hours would you be right, thinking that as you go past, but you're right. So you have a belief, it's true. It seems that it's justified in the sense that you live a normal life around clocks, we trust them. When you walk along and you see clocks, oh yeah, keep going. But the usual response is, it's not knowledge. So people say, well, but did you know that it's 2 o'clock? Often people emphasize the word knowledge, so whatever. But they say, you can cheat more, you can say, but do you really know that it's 2 o'clock? But anyway, do you know that it's 2 o'clock? Standard answer, no. If not, it's a Gettier case. So that's what happened in 1963 with Gettier's contribution. By the way, I don't think he ever did any more epistemology.
Just came in, cleaned up and left.
He came in sort of,
Yeah.
let something loose in the room and just walked away.
Yeah. I mean, all these cases have an element of epistemic luck about them. But you might think that, any time we know something, there's some luck involved. Can we ever eliminate luck, do you think, from our knowledge-making practices?
Probably not, but potentially there are different kinds of luck in this situation. Let me give you, so for example, for a start, when you say that maybe there's always luck, here's one kind of luck that there might always be there. That might always be there, but some people think is irrelevant. Evidential epistemic luck is what's the idea that you look up at the right moment, you just look up and you see the person robbing the bank. It's just lucky you look up at that moment and you get this belief and it's correct. So there's luck in there. But the usual response would be, yeah, but that's not the kind of luck we're talking about. Yeah, you looked up, but then you had this perfect or really good sort of rational interaction. You looked, the evidence was normal, no problem. So that's one kind of luck. But the usual response will be that Gettier cases are a little different. So this is sometimes called, it's not a very elegant term, but it's called veritic luck. So but all it means is luck in getting at the truth relative to the evidence. So the idea is, let's just take it, however you got your evidence, luckily or normally or whatever, once it's there, it's there. But relative to that evidence, once you use it, have you been lucky again? So like in the Gettier case, the idea is you look in, and for you as a rational being outside the field, there's nothing odd or lucky. You're looking in a normal way. But in fact, there's something, given that that it's a disguised sheep, then relative to that, it's lucky that you end up with a true belief. So it's lucky that there is this actual sheep in the field. So it's like you have bad luck in the first place because you're getting deceived. And then there's good luck, which sort of counteracts and, puts you back in the sense of, puts you again in contact with truth. Now, that's more complex. So sometimes people call that like a double luck structure. It's just a term, but the idea is that, sort of bad luck, good luck, and you end up being right. That's one sort of format. A lot of epistemologists will rest content with that, and they think, well, so that's why your belief isn't knowledge. As I say, it's all still being contested, but that's one view, yeah.
Mm. So do you think there's, a definitive answer to the Gettier problems yourself?
Oh, I don't know about definitive. That would be presumptuous to say. Yeah, I've got a book coming out next year. which
Another product placement?
Product placement called Knowledge and the Gettier Problem. So I do have a go at it in there, but it gets kind of picky. But in a way, I actually end up going back to a version of the justified true belief conception. I actually argue that there are reasons why none of the 50 years, none of the attempts by epistemologists to analyse the case so that they can get a new definition have succeeded. And then I sort of offer a bit of a replacement. But it ends up being a kind of picture whereby I do say something like, there is inevitably a kind of luck. I like to think of it more as a kind of fallibility that you can't escape. And I kind of worry in that book that this is actually kind of a big issue in epistemology. See, when people think about knowledge, like if you go away and you think about knowledge, you've got to try to ask yourself really hard, can you really live with fallibility and call things knowledge? See, I reckon a lot of people will say, yes, they're fallibilists. Like, yeah, they accept the idea that we make mistakes and all that. That's all simple to say. But when you put people on the spot and you say things like, do you know that you're going to, do you know that what you're going to eat for dinner tomorrow night? And someone might say, well, I've got such and such in the fridge, so yeah, there's enough of it, so that's what I'm going to have tomorrow night, so yeah, I know that. And then someone else says, but do you really know it? Because surely there are ways your belief could be wrong, right? The things, your fridge could malfunction between today and tomorrow. Someone could just give you an offer you can't refuse to go out to buy. And you say, well, yeah, that's true. So it is possible. Now, so this is a point about just, ask yourself, is that a case where if you would then withdraw the claim to knowledge and say, well, I guess I don't really know? Or you'd say something like, well, right now, I still think I know, but I acknowledge that, for example, I don't know perfectly, or I don't know infallibly, but I'm still prepared to say I know. So one of the issues then for the Gettier kind of history is exactly this role about fallibility in forming your beliefs. Gettier himself, when he introduced the cases, he had a couple of principles, and one of them was exactly the idea that we'll take as an hypothesis here that knowledge, we start out that the justified true belief conception of knowledge is compatible with the justification component being fallible. And then in the end, so we start with that, and then we get this belief which seems to be true and it's justified fallibly, and yet people are then not prepared to say that it's knowledge. So here's just the simple question, which I can't resolve here or probably anywhere, but how do people know when they're reacting to Gettier cases that they're not simply being an infallibilist and they don't know that about themselves? Because if that's the case, then they're not. I don't think they're justified in their reactions. So you've got to know. It's like you've got to keep a sense of yourself throughout and say. It's like saying I don't know. Maybe it's like someone who says, "Yeah, I endorse this kind of nice sounding view," but then when it comes to it, maybe they don't follow through with the consequences. So if someone says, "Yeah, I'm a fallibilist about knowledge. I accept that mistakes are possible," but then when you get a case where someone ended up with a true belief, but it was kind of funny along the way, the question, my reaction is to say something like, well, that's just what fallibility involves. And that's what fallible knowledge would involve sometimes. And some other people, and I'm not sure that people are holding that idea in their mind. And it's very easy to say, oh no, that's not really knowledge. But you don't know for sure that you're not suddenly switching and applying a higher standard, like an infallible standard suddenly, even though you started out saying, I'm fallibilist, like a realistic fallibilist. You know, people who say, yeah, of course, we have knowledge, in normal ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. You've got two sets of standards, one in practice and the other, for the philosophy classroom.
It's like monitor yourself and sort of think, am I really genuinely still applying this kind of more realistic everyday standard, or have I suddenly switched to a really high, more technical standard, which could be irrelevant?
So speaking about philosophical standards, do you think that the problem of skepticism is a problem of philosophers' own making?
Well, when you say their own making, you sort of imply that somehow if we weren't philosophers, not only would we never think of it, but we somehow it would just not be applicable. That's quite a powerful sort of idea. I mean, the skeptics, and there are different versions of skeptical argument, but kind of, let's say, one very simple, straightforward idea is the idea that says, let's say that there are contexts or there are ways of coming to think about ourselves whereby we suddenly feel our vulnerability as believers, and we sort of think there really are ways we could be wrong. We don't have to think we are wrong, but we think we could be wrong. And then then you're inclined to say, well, hang on, but if we don't know that we're not wrong in that way, then all those beliefs that we've been comfortingly having no longer measure up. Now, so for example, there are lots of ways to get at skeptical ideas, but just if you said something like, if you had some sort of general idea that suppose you said there was some kind of possible way that humans were built whereby we just weren't bright enough, for example, to know things. But we nonetheless have this tendency to think we know things. And we can never catch ourselves out, because that's the point. We always think we're going to know, but there are means by which we just always fall short. Okay, here's the point. You're asking, well, that is a philosophical kind of concern, in that epistemologists have long raised this kind of worry. In modern philosophy, particularly Descartes from about 400 years ago is particularly associated with it, but he's not the only one. But some of his ideas, his versions of it, were particularly memorable. But the question, what you're asking is, the question is whether that when we go through our everyday lives, we never think of these possibilities. The skeptics, though, the philosophical skeptic says, big deal. It doesn't matter whether you think about them or not, they apply to you. Effectively, your question, I think, is saying, well, but is that not true? Is that like just the philosopher thinking? Like saying, it's like saying, what I think is important is somehow you all have to think is important, because it applies to you all. So you could all be wrong, and you all have to look to me to show you the way out of this kind of possible problem. Well, so that's the worry about skepticism there. But there are philosophers who try to argue that, in effect, if you get on with everyday life, particularly if it's possible to know things very fallibly, then you don't have to engage with skeptical worries, nor do they have to be, nor does anyone have to show why they don't apply. So like, the old, how do you know you're not dreaming? Right now. The dreaming would be supposedly presenting you with apparently sensory evidence right now, and anything you point to, if you say, oh, but hang on, here's something really realistic, that really looks like a hand, and you say, yeah, sure, well, but it's still a dream, or it could be. And at a certain point, the question is this genuinely a possibility we have to know how to set aside, or is it just somehow irrelevant? So look, like the Gettier problem, there is no agreed upon response to this among epistemologists. It's still, no matter that it's hundreds of years old, thousands. I mean, look, Plato, the dreaming possibilities I mentioned Descartes with, it's there in Plato as well. So, you know, it's long been there in Western philosophy, and there is still no agreed upon way to respond to it. I think that somehow the answer's got to again be to work out a genuinely fallibilist and adequate, but fallibilist conception of knowledge. Because otherwise, if you somehow leave yourself open to infallibilist criteria or standards, you inevitably let these kind of possibilities sort of seep in, and then it's really hard to set them aside without just looking dogmatic, for example, and just not very philosophical.
Can I press you a little bit on the fallibilism? If we are fallibilists, what value do you think having the verb to know adds? I mean, why don't we just, do with true belief?
Oh, look, gee whiz. I actually see the problem is, I actually think that is absolutely how we could go. But this is a very non-standard view. All right, so let me give you a more standard view to start with, which is just that a fallibilist could still make distinctions between degrees of fallibility. So one position that, for example, I've argued for is the idea that there could be degrees or grades of knowledge. But you can allow that within a fallibilist picture. So, for example, you could say, suppose I say, well, here's an example I like, which I've used. So I know that this is a hand, but a hand surgeon also could know that this is a hand, but he or she is going to, I think, is going to know that this is a hand in tons more detail than I know it's a hand. So the way I think of it is, they know better. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree on this, and not everyone will, but the picture I like is that my kind of fallibilism is that they will have a less fallible conception of what's going on there. So when I say it's a hand, sure, I know it in a kind of normal, everyday way. The hand surgeon knows it in great detail. And that means that, he or she can answer all kinds of questions about it. Even the concept of a hand. So like borderline cases, maybe there are interesting cases about hands where you sort of wonder, is it a hand, is it not? And they'll just be better. So I reckon I have fallible knowledge. I reckon they have fallible knowledge, but their fallible knowledge is better. To your more radical question about whether we could just call true belief knowledge and have done with it, personally I reckon we could, and I've argued for that else in at least one book as well. But most epistemologists not many epistemologists will agree with that, but what I offer is the idea that you can think of as a true belief as a kind of knowledge, but it's the worst degree of knowledge. So if you genuinely believe something and you're right, you genuinely believe it. I mean, you're not having second thoughts or doubting or clearly guessing. You do believe it. And, you'll say you do, you feel you do, and you're right. The belief is right. Then I think that is knowledge. But I think it's conceptually the worst degree of knowledge. We've got to have a worst degree, if there are degrees. But then, if you then start to get a bit more evidence, you've improved that knowledge. A little more, you've improved it still. So that's part of this kind of picture. For example, you could start modeling scientific inquiry in this way. So a scientist, for example, on my kind of fallibilism, I allow like a scientist, say, for example, with a bold but confident sort of hypothesis, could start off, if it's right, then that's the first bit of scientific knowledge of that truth. Then they proceed to test it. Now maybe, for example, suppose they lost confidence for a bit, then maybe they'd lose the knowledge. But then maybe the confidence comes back. The knowledge is back. Then they get more corroborating evidence. It gets better, goes back a bit better. It's fluid, but it can still say is more or less good knowledge. And anyway, so it's the idea that you've got a dynamic kind of possibility there. So yeah, I think so. If you just sort of, if someone just says, "Oh, look, true belief is knowledge," well, that sounds a bit odd, out of context. But I think if you embed it in a bigger fallibilism, I don't think it's so odd. But it is a minority view.
All right, one last question, perhaps the hardest question. What's your favourite joke in epistemology?
Joke. This is Bertrand Russell, the great 19th and 20th century English philosopher. He was a renowned atheist. And the idea was, someone said, "But Mr. Russell, if you were to, after you die, if you were to then meet God, and if God was to say, what would you say if God said, 'Why didn't you believe in me?'" And Russell's answer, the excellent epistemologist that he was something like, "But Lord, you didn't give us enough evidence." so that was his. That was
true to his principles.
Yeah, exactly. So that's like when I said beginning. You're going to think of it epistemologically. You've got to take absolutely seriously the idea of evidence for beliefs and take that seriously. What do two skeptics say to each other? I don't know. What does a skeptic say to a non-skeptic? Hope I get this right. Let's see. I know that you don't know, that I don't know, that you don't know, that... What's the question again? Something like that.
Very good.
It's a start.
Well, all I can say is that if I'm dreaming, then this has been one of the better dreams. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Deb. Thanks for having me.